The words came like frost cutting through warm air. Dad, if you died early, maybe Mom and I could finally breathe. For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. But the clock on the wall kept ticking. Slow, deliberate, like a judge reading a sentence. The roast turkey sat untouched. The candles flickered against Linda's quiet face. And my son, Ethan, 27, wouldn't even look at me. I'm Richard Hale, 62, a retired engineer who once believed hard work could build anything, homes, bridges, even love. But that night, sitting under the soft glow of Christmas lights, I realized some cracks don't show up on blueprints. They start in silence, in sighs, in the way your own child avoids your eyes. Maybe you've had a moment like that, when someone you love says something that doesn't just hurt, it rewrites who you thought you were. I kept wondering, how did I become the villain in my own house? Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. Because what I'm about to tell you, it isn't just another family drama. It's the story of how one Christmas dinner unraveled the truth about a secret fortune, a quiet betrayal, and the kind of revenge that doesn't come with anger, but with understanding. That night, as snow piled on the windowsill and laughter from the neighbors bled faintly through the cold, I realized this wasn't just a holiday gone wrong. It was the beginning of something buried, something that had been waiting for years to surface. Linda's eyes met mine, soft but distant. Ethan clenched his fork, the metal scraping the plate like a warning. And in that silence, between love and resentment, I felt it. The shift. I smiled, though my chest ached. Well, I said quietly, Merry Christmas. And that, unbeknownst to me, was the night my family's truth began to thaw. It's strange when your own home starts to feel unfamiliar. The pictures on the walls still smile, but the warmth behind them fades. I used to think a man's house was his sanctuary, a place that kept his story safe. But lately, every sound in mine feels like a whisper I'm not supposed to hear. Linda's been locking her phone. Ethan doesn't come home much anymore. The rooms echo differently when there's less laughter in them. Even the old floorboards creak, as if they're holding secrets. Last night, I woke to the sound of voices down the hall. Faint, but sharp enough to slice through sleep. A woman's voice, Linda's, hushed and hurried. Then a man's, low and certain. Once it's done, we'll sell it. No one needs to know. I sat up, my chest tight. Sell what? I waited until the whispering stopped, then stared at the ceiling for hours, pretending not to hear my own heartbeat counting questions I wasn't ready to ask. In the morning, sunlight spilled through the curtains like nothing had happened. Linda was making coffee, humming softly to some tune from the radio. I tried to match her calm. Linda, I said carefully, who were you talking to last night? She froze, just for a second, then smiled too quickly. A friend. You wouldn't know her. I nodded. A friend who talks about selling our house? Her voice sharpened. Don't start again, Richard. Not today. I let it go. Or pretended to. But as she left for her morning walk, I found myself tracing the walls of this place. Our place. Every brick, every nail, every weekend I spent repairing what time had worn down. This house wasn't just a building. It was 37 years of our life together. It was worth around $850,000 now, but to me, its value was measured in sweat and quiet evenings. Later that day, while folding laundry, I found something tucked inside the pocket of Linda's coat. A business card. Marcus & Green Real Estate Law, Property Settlement Division. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of paper that shouldn't have been there. Was she planning to sell without me? Or was this something worse, something already decided? That night, I walked down the hallway again. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. I stood outside our bedroom door, listening to the silence that used to be comfort. If love can fade that quietly, how long before it disappears completely? The basement has always been my quiet place. When the world upstairs grows too loud, I come down here. The air is thick with oil and dust, the scent of old tools and forgotten years. Every shelf, every screw jar holds a memory of something once useful, once cared for. Down here, time doesn't move as fast. I ran my fingers across the cold steel of my workbench, where I used to build tiny mechanical models, bridges, clocks, gears that turned just for the beauty of turning. They were small things, but they gave me peace. I could make something that worked, something that stayed together. Now the house above feels like it's breaking apart piece by piece. As I searched through an old stack of boxes, I found one I didn't recognize. A wooden chest, worn and locked, with the words carved faintly on its lid. For when I'm gone. I hadn't seen it in years, my father's handwriting. I sat down on the concrete floor, the chill seeping through my jeans, and traced the letters. He'd always been a quiet man, not one for long talks, but his words carried weight. I used to think I'd never become like him. Maybe I already have. I found the small brass key in the drawer beside my old lathe and turned it slowly. The lid creaked open like a door to another life. Inside, neatly folded papers, a certificate, a letter, and beneath them, an envelope marked confidential investments. The numbers made my heart pause. $700,000 in energy shares. I hadn't seen these in over a decade. I'd nearly forgotten I'd transferred them into a private portfolio, meant as a safety net, something Linda never knew existed, something untouched by the years. I smiled bitterly. "You were right, Dad," I whispered into the dim air. "They only come close when they need something." A voice startled me. "What's that, Dad?" Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing, his expression unreadable. The light from the kitchen spilled down, slicing through the darkness between us. "Just memories," I said softly. "You wouldn't care." He hesitated, then turned away, footsteps fading. The door shut. I sat there for a long time, holding that envelope like it was proof of something. Proof that I still existed. That I still had something left that was mine. Maybe the basement is the only place where I'm still alive. The night was quiet. The kind that makes every sound stretch longer than it should. I sat in the living room, the fireplace dimmed to a faint glow, when I heard her voice. Linda's voice, soft, hushed from the kitchen. "Yes, once he's gone, we'll finalize the policy. It's better that way." The words moved through the air like a slow knife. "Once he's gone." I stayed still, barely breathing. I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the ticking clock on the mantel, every sound except the heartbeat pounding in my ears. She hung up, and for a few seconds, silence reclaimed the house. Then I stepped forward. "Linda," I said quietly. "Who was that?" She turned sharply, the phone still in her hand. Her face froze before softening into a nervous smile. "You're paranoid," she said. "Maybe you should see a doctor." "I'm fine," I replied. "But are you?" Something flickered in her eyes, a mix of fear and calculation. She walked past me, up the stairs, her perfume trailing behind. I stood there, the words "once he's gone" still echoing. The next morning, the first thing I saw on my bank app was a withdrawal, $12,000, from our joint account. No note, no mention, nothing. Just gone. Later that afternoon, Ethan called. "Dad, have you ever thought about writing a will?" he asked casually. I laughed, though it sounded more like a cough. "Why? You worried I'll take the secret recipe to the grave?" He didn't laugh. "It's just smart planning. Mom said, Never mind what Mom said," I cut in. "Tell me what you think." Silence. Then a quick goodbye. The line went dead. That night, while taking out the trash, I saw it. An envelope sticking halfway out of the bin, stained with coffee. A life insurance folder. My name on it. Richard Hale. I pulled it out and brushed off the dirt. My signature was there, except it wasn't mine. The R curled wrong, the loops uneven. Someone had tried to be me and failed just enough for me to notice. The chill outside crept into my bones. For years I'd believed in forgiveness, in family, in the quiet strength of loyalty. But standing there under the porch light, I realized something had broken. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was betrayal, plain and deliberate. And somewhere deep inside, the urge to seek balance, to make things right, began to stir like the first spark in a long, slow-burning revenge story. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was proof. Days began blending together like old paint on a forgotten wall. Morning, night, it didn't matter anymore. I stopped eating properly. Food had no taste when trust had already soured. Most of my hours were spent in the basement, my sanctuary, my cell. Light slipped through the narrow crack under the door, just enough to remind me the world above was still turning without me. Sometimes I'd sit there and stare at the dust floating in the air, thinking how even dust gets to dance when light touches it. Funny, isn't it? You spend your life building, providing, loving, and one day you realize you've become invisible in your own home. I found myself thinking about Linda when she was young. Her laughter. The way she used to sing off-key in the kitchen while I fixed things around the house. For a moment, I could almost hear it again, until I remembered who she'd become. "When did you stop loving me, Linda?" I asked one night, my voice calm, almost gentle. She didn't look up from her phone. Maybe when you stopped being useful. There was no anger in her tone. Just vacancy. I stood there, watching her scroll through a life that didn't include me. My throat burned, but I didn't let it show. I turned and walked away, tears falling like they'd been waiting for permission. Back in the basement, I opened a fresh notebook. I started writing. Dates, times, movements. Linda and Ethan leaving the house, returning. Trips to the bank. I wrote it all. It wasn't madness, it was clarity. When trust breaks, facts become the only form of sanity. By the end of the week, I had pages filled. 3 visits to the same branch, different hours. Always together. No explanations. That's when I called Mark, an old friend from my engineering days. He'd gone into law after retiring. The kind of man who spoke softly but carried a file cabinet full of secrets. He listened quietly, then said, "Richard, if your name's on that insurance and it's forged, they can go to prison." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea of justice suddenly sounded absurdly foreign in my own house. "Prison," I said softly. "You think I'm strong enough to watch them fall that far?" He sighed. "You don't have to push them. Just pull the truth into the light. It'll do the rest." That night, I stared at my notebook. The shaky handwriting, the timestamps, the desperate proof that I wasn't crazy. Maybe that was how justice began. Not with vengeance or rage, but with quiet documentation. Maybe justice starts with a single page of truth. It's strange how pretending to be weak can make you feel powerful. I bought a small camera, the kind hidden inside a wall clock, and mounted it above the living room mantel. The ticking sound covered the faint hum of the lens. Ironic, considering time was exactly what they were counting down. I started coughing more, on purpose at first. Then it became real. Maybe stress has a way of listening when you lie to it. I scheduled a visit to my doctor, asked for a full checkup. When he handed me a report that mentioned a heart irregularity, I didn't correct him. Sometimes truth and performance overlap so neatly that even you can't tell the difference anymore. That evening, I sat by the window with a blanket over my shoulders. Ethan walked in, looking uneasy. "Dad, you look terrible," he said, his voice carrying just enough guilt to sound rehearsed. "Guess I'm dying faster than you hoped," I replied, smiling faintly. He frowned. "Don't twist my words. Then stop giving me reasons to," I said quietly. The silence that followed was colder than the Oregon rain outside. Later that night, the living room camera blinked once, recording. Linda's voice came first, low and steady. "Once the paperwork clears, we'll split it evenly," Ethan replied. $1.2 million, Mom. We'll finally be free." The way he said free hit me harder than any diagnosis. I sat in the basement, watching their faces on the small monitor, the grainy footage flickering like ghosts confessing their sins. There was no hesitation in them. No love left to hide behind. I copied the files to a hard drive and slipped it into my old toolbox, the one with the broken latch, tucked behind stacks of mechanical models I'd built decades ago. It felt symbolic somehow. The same hands that once built things to last were now building a quiet trap. I thought about what freedom meant to them. Maybe it wasn't about money. Maybe it was about erasing the part of their lives that reminded them of decency. Or maybe they truly believed I stood in the way of their happiness. If they saw me as dead already, maybe I could use that to live. It's astonishing how easy it is to fake the end of your life when the people closest to you are already halfway convinced you're gone. One quiet afternoon, I clutched my chest during a walk in the garden, staggered, and let the world fade around me just long enough for Linda's scream to sound real. The hospital lights came next, cold, fluorescent, unfeeling. I lay there, eyes half open, watching her from the edge of my vision. She wasn't crying, she was calculating. Ethan arrived 2 hours later. His face showed a flicker of worry, but it vanished as soon as he caught Linda's eye. They whispered near the foot of my bed, believing the steady beep of my heart monitor meant I couldn't hear them. My phone, hidden beneath the pillow, was recording everything. Ethan asked, "Should we list the house now?" Linda replied, soft but certain. "Not yet. Wait until the death certificate." The words sliced through the sterile air sharper than any surgical tool. Their voices didn't shake. Not once. I stayed perfectly still, a dying man to their eyes, but inside I was more awake than ever. I thought of the years I spent keeping this family together. Birthdays, mortgage payments, Sunday dinners. Maybe this was what came of loving people who only loved your usefulness. When the doctor called it a minor stroke, Linda exhaled in disappointment before quickly masking it as relief. I signed the discharge papers the next morning and smiled faintly when Ethan said, "You're lucky, Dad." "Luck's got nothing to do with it," I replied. "Some of us just refuse to stay buried." On my way home, I stopped by Mark's office, the old lawyer who still owed me a favor. He looked at me like a ghost who hadn't realized he was still walking the earth. Without a word, I handed him the flash drive containing the audio. "Keep this safe," I said. "If anything happens, you'll know what to do." Mark listened to a few seconds. His expression darkened. "You sure you want to play this game, Richard?" "It's not a game," I said quietly. "It's a lesson." He nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. In every family drama, there comes a moment when love curdles into survival. This was mine. I didn't plan to forgive them. Not yet. But I wasn't ready to destroy them either. Not until they understood what it meant to lose something real. Sometimes you have to die once to see who mourns you and who celebrates. 3 weeks passed, and the house seemed quieter than it ever had before. Dust settled on the piano Linda never played, and the smell of her favorite perfume still lingered faintly in the curtains. I spent those weeks practicing my smile in the mirror, the kind of gentle, forgiving grin that hides a loaded gun behind it. When I called Linda to invite her and Ethan for a 30th anniversary dinner, her voice was light, almost cheerful. "That's sweet, Richard. After everything, maybe this is good for us." "Yes," I said softly. A celebration of truth. That night, the table gleamed with candlelight and silverware. The roast chicken smelled just like it did 20 years ago, when we still pretended to be happy. Ethan arrived first, dressed in a suit too sharp for sincerity. Linda followed, radiant as ever, wearing the same pearl necklace I'd bought her back when love still felt possible. We laughed, we toasted, we talked about nothing. Weather, work, how nice it was to sit together again. If deceit had a flavor, it would taste like overcooked wine and forced smiles. Then, as Linda reached for dessert, I lifted the remote and pointed it at the TV. "I wanted to play a little family video tonight," I said, my tone casual. The screen flickered. Then came the sound. Ethan's voice, nervous but eager. "Should we list the house now?" Linda's reply followed, crisp and cruel. "Not yet. Wait until the death certificate." The fork clattered from her hand. Ethan's eyes went wide, his jaw tight. "Richard, what is this?" Linda whispered. "The truth," I said calmly. "You should try it sometime." Ethan slammed his fist on the table. "You set us up!" I smiled faintly. No, son, you set me up." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. For a second, I almost felt pity. Almost. Then Linda's rage broke through the shock. She hurled her wine glass across the room, red liquid streaking the wall like blood. Ethan stood abruptly, muttering something about air, about leaving. The front door slammed, and only the sound of the flickering TV remained. On the screen, frozen faces stared back at me. Linda's sharp, Ethan's hollow. The reflection of that cold light painted my own face in shades I barely recognized. Funny thing about truth, it never kills you outright. It just strips you bare until there's nothing left but the bones of who you really are. In the end, when the masks fall, do we recognize the people we loved, or just strangers wearing our names? The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and old wood, like a place where truth came not to live, but to be dissected. Richard sat quietly at the defense table, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing. The recordings played again, that same conversation looping like a cruel lullaby. Linda's voice filled the room, trembling now, not from guilt, but from exposure. Ethan sat 2 rows behind her, face pale, lips pressed tight and the weight of shame heavy on his shoulders. When it was over, the judge barely hesitated. Fraud, forgery, intent to deceive. The words fell like stones. Linda didn't look at Richard once. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she finally saw what she had become. Outside, Portland's gray sky seemed to echo his mood. Muted, cold, but strangely peaceful. Mark met him on the courthouse steps, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "You could have taken revenge," he said, half a smile playing at the edge of his mouth. Richard looked out at the city, the streets slick with rain. "This is revenge," he murmured. "It just doesn't scream." He didn't stay in the house after that. It had already stopped feeling like home long ago. When the bank came for it, he didn't fight. He packed only a few boxes, old photographs, his father's tools, and that wooden model ship he never finished. Everything else could burn. Ethan's name hit the news next, tangled in the mess of his mother's trial. He lost his job within a week. The world has a way of punishing quietly, slow, deliberate, without fire or applause. Richard sold what remained of his investments and transferred the last of his savings to the Marjorie Hale Foundation, named for his mother, who'd believed that kindness could still change the world. Maybe this was his way of keeping her voice alive, even when his own felt hollow. A week later, Linda called. He let it ring twice before answering. Her tone was soft, fragile. "Richard, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking clearly. I never meant—" He cut her off gently. "You wanted my death," he said, voice even. "Now live with my silence." There was nothing left to add. That night, he sat alone in a small rented apartment, listening to the rain against the window. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded. He closed his eyes, not in grief, but in something closer to relief. Forgiveness isn't always mercy. Sometimes it's just distance. The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific like a slow exhale, softening the edges of everything it touched. Richard sat by the window of a small cabin near Cannon Beach. a mug of coffee warming his hands. The sea outside was restless, but it spoke to him in a language he had finally learned to understand. One of patience, not noise. He hadn't seen Ethan in nearly a year. Then, one quiet afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was uncertain, almost hesitant. It said that Linda had passed away 2 months earlier. "I need to see you," Ethan wrote. "There are things I need to say." 2 days later, they met at a small diner by the highway. Ethan looked older, thinner, his confidence stripped away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. Mom was lost in her own fear, and I followed her." Richard studied him, searching his face for the boy he once knew, the one who used to run barefoot through the garden, chasing fireflies. "You were young," Richard said softly, "and scared. We all make bargains with fear. Some just cost more than others." Ethan's eyes welled. "I didn't think you'd forgive me." Richard smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't a gift. It's a decision to stop carrying the fire." When Ethan left, he hugged his father. Awkwardly at first, then tightly, as if letting go would erase him again. The door closed behind him with a sound that wasn't final, just different. Now, alone in his cabin, Richard replayed that moment in his mind. For the first time in years, his heart didn't feel like a locked room. He thought about how life had twisted his family through betrayal and quiet deceit, yet somehow left behind something strangely pure, a small seed of understanding. He turned to his journal, writing slowly, deliberately. "I once thought my family was my legacy. Now I know, peace is the only inheritance worth leaving." The seagulls cried outside, slicing through the mist. The tide was coming in. Richard set his pen down, letting the sound of the waves carry him somewhere beyond regret. He looked at his reflection in the window, faint and flickering, and smiled. "If you lost everything today," he whispered, "would you still know who you are?" The ocean didn't answer. It never does. But in its silence, Richard found something close to grace. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. Thank you for watching. May your heart be light, your home be warm, and your family, however imperfect, find its way back to love. Stay tuned for the next story, one that might just begin where this one ends.